Well, hello, everybody. We're very pleased tonight to bring a special speaker to you. And I'll call him Dr. Kyle McCord because he's a full-fledged, PhD. And he is a wonderful speaker, and he's here representing a hybrid publishing house called Atmosphere Press. And let me just tell you a little bit about him as we get started. Dr. Kyle McCord is the author of 7 books, including National Poetry Series finalist Magpies in the Valley of Oleanders and the novel Reunion of the Good Weather Suicide Cult. Now that's a title I'm interested in. He has work featured or forthcoming in Agni, Blackbird, Boston Review, the Gettysburg Review, the Harvard Review, the Kenyon Review, Plowshares, Tri-Quarterly, and elsewhere. He's received grants or awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Baltic Writing Residency. Kyle holds an MFA from University of Massachusetts Amherst and a PhD from the University of North Texas. He served as Associate Poetry Editor of The Nation and currently serves as Executive Editor of Gold Wake Press and Acquisitions Director for Atmosphere Press. He is married to the visual artist Lydia McCord and lives in Des Moines, Iowa. So welcome to you, Kyle. We're happy to have you with us. And I just kind of am curious how you ended up with Atmosphere Press. You're a busy guy.
Yes, thank you, Linda. And thanks to all of you guys for being here. Let me talk a little bit about my journey towards um, eventually working as an editor for Atmosphere. And also, the book that Linda mentioned, Reunion of the Good Weather Suicide Cult, is also published with Atmosphere, right? Um, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what my writing journey has been like, partially because it'll give you a sense of how Atmosphere came to be and why it came to be the way that it is, how we eventually concluded that this was something that we wanted to do. So, when I graduated with my MFA, right, I'm going way back, Linda, so I'll swing back to how I ended up at Atmosphere. Um, I I was very blessed to have my first book picked up by in an open reading period, which is really tricky to do. Generally, when you send a book to an open reading period, you should probably assume that a contest, reading periods, those kinds of things, it can depend, but you're looking at anywhere from a couple hundred books that you're competing with to a couple thousand, right? Or if you're sending it to a literary agent, you might be competing with tens of thousands, depending on how popular they are. Um, and so my book was picked up by Dream Horse Press. It's by the editor who now runs Verse Daily. It's an amazing poetry website. Um, and, I had a great experience working with him. There were definitely some things I found to be really challenging about traditional publishing, some in the immediate moment and some sort of afterwards. One was that I'm a really anxious person. I'm a writer, so I guess it's not totally shocking. But I would often write to the editor and I would like not hear back from him for long periods of time. And it wasn't that he was being rude, it's that he was a busy guy, right? And so he was doing a bunch of other books, and I sort of had to assume that things were going to be okay. And that was a reasonable assumption because it panned out to be true. Now, um, and then I also found it challenging that when I was done, I was like, okay, well, what's going to happen? And there wasn't really a marketing plan because a lot of times with presses, even with very big presses, you often end up being sort of a labor of love where one person does all of the work. Now, that you might be surprised to learn is even true for books that come out with the big four, right? 96% of the books that come out with the big four publishers sell less than 2,000 copies, which means that those presses are not pushing those all that hard because the other 4%, is what gets made into movies and what achieves bestseller status. And it's from a lot of people who might already be benefiting from pre-existing, let's put it this way, maybe they were already famous before they ever published the book, right? That kind of stuff. Or, they're a very gifted writer. That often happens too, but it depends, right? Um, and so what I found was that I, put a tour together with with another person from the press, which became sort of a theme in my life. And we did this big 27-day tour all around the US. And it was really stuff that we had set up, right? And when we were on the trip, one of the things I realized was that I really wanted people to buy the book from me and not from the website. Now, why was this? Not because I was stingy about it, but because I was out there putting gas in the car. I was out there, you know, get, eating fast food to make things happen, right? And I really wanted to, and so I really needed that revenue. And when I sold a book through the website, I saw a very small amount of that proportion, right? Um, and that ends up being true to this day, right? Which is when you publish with a traditional publisher, one of the conceivable downsides is that you are still paying them decades after you work with them because they are still getting 90% of the proceeds or 85 90% of the proceeds from your book long after you've published it, right? So um, fast forward a little bit, I published another group of books with different folks, and one of the things that happened along the way was that Nick Courtwright, who's currently the executive editor at Atmosphere, and I were on another press called Goldwake, and they put out a couple of my books. They put out Nick's first book, and they were working on his second. And the person who was running the press had a total mental breakdown. Like, was completely you wasn't making sense. Was definitely feeling very unwell. And so uh, there were still 6 books on the docket left to come out for Goldwake. And Nick said, well, you know what? We should just take charge of the press, have these books come out, and we'll have to do a lot of stuff from scratch. We'll have to learn a lot about editorial. And we did, right? And that is one of the ways we'd been in editorial before, but this was a totally different role because we'd never been head editor before. I'd been a reader for lots of presses. I had been in charge of a poetry website. I've been the associate editor for The Nation, lots of different stuff. But I'd never been the person who was like, how does the book get? And in the process, Nick and I got connected with all these other folks who were in the writing community. And they were folks who made covers, knew how to do interior design, knew how to do developmental editorial. And so Nick and I ran a traditional press for about 5 to 6 years. If you were ever at the Associated Writing Programs Conference, we were the most aggressive people there. We were selling those books. You were walking in the aisle past us, you were having a conversation with us. We were finding out where you were from, what you were doing. And we actually used a slightly different model, which was a lot of contests said you have to, pay $20. We said you have to buy a book because then you know what our press is about, and then you can enter our contest for free. Um, and at a certain point, Nick said, Kyle, this is good, but there's a lot of problems with it. One, it's not very sustainable for the people who are actually doing the work for us. And additionally, it's not terribly sustainable for the writers because there aren't enough resources on the marketing end. And, we don't have enough money to buy, to pay a marketing team or any of these other folks. Additionally, because the royalties checks weren't very high, it wasn't making anybody really all that happy. And so Nick said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to, he started working with writers in sort of a hybrid capacity where there would be an upfront cost to publish the book. And then that money would go into paying all the people who were, working for the press, who were not just like okay at what they were doing, but who are really, really good at what they're doing, right? What I'm talking about is, we have a cover designer who wins awards. He is really quite good. And we had, children's books illustrators, we had interior designers, we had proofers, we had people who were uh, just amazing managing editors, and we were able to bring them in under one roof. Now, I am not easily sold. That is why I'm the director of acquisitions, is because I'm somebody who let's put it this way, you have a few pages to charm me, and I'd love to be charmed. I would as a reader, but that's true in the business sense too. And I, had been a professor for a very long time. I basically, I've been teaching here at Drake. I taught at Drake for about 10 years, right? And I actually just recently retired from teaching and do other things now, primarily atmosphere as my main role. And so Nick had to sell me on this. And he said, look, here's all the ways that this is better. And I started working for them. And what I loved was my job as a developmental editor was to have conversations with people about their books, where I would go through and say, here's all the things that I love about this. Here's my vision for it. Here's 3 things that I think could change or they could shift, right? And then they didn't have to do what I said. They could say, you know what? I really love idea number 1 and idea number 3. And maybe I think I want to change a little bit here or there, but it became a collaborative process where writers got to have a conversation with me and we got to walk step by step through that, right? Additionally, Nick said, let's have you start looking at the projects and be more involved with this. And the more I got involved with it, to be honest, I really liked what other people were getting, because when I had published traditionally, I'd had so much trouble getting reviews for my book. I had real trouble, getting the kinds of, even though they were books that won awards, it was hard to get the kind of interest that I really was looking for as a writer. I wanted someone to say, here's what we're going to do, here's our expertise, here's how we do this. And that's exactly what Cam Finch and the team did. They came in and said, okay, what do you care about? I said, I really want to see major reviews for the book. They did a NetGalley campaign, they did a Goodreads campaign. They got me an interview on my local NPR affiliate. They got my book. My book was picked as one of the top 32 books of the year for the Independent Book Review. They did all sorts of things. We just had one really big win for Atmosphere, the North Street Prize, which is awarded to a hybrid press book, and they have thousands to pick from. They picked one of our books as the winner, and the author got $10,000, which was huge. You can better believe we shouted that from the rooftops, and we will continue to do so, right?
Mhm.
Because it tells you, one of our rules is that writers get to be the beneficiary of their success. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a few things that um, ultimately Linda kind of mentioned to me as being um, important in terms of thinking about where we go when we want to publish. So here's what I would say. I'm not here to tell you hybrid publishing is the only way to publish, right? I would not pretend that that's true. People find different routes that work for them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks in the market who are not particularly great actors, right? I talk to people on a day-to-day basis who have had a publishing experience that hasn't been so great. I don't want that for any of you. And so I'm going to talk you through a little bit of what your possibilities are, the pluses and minuses, and what you should expect. Okay. Let's start with what a lot of people imagine when they think about publishing, which is traditional publishing. Okay. An interesting question, by the way, is why do we think about that as being the very first thing? Because we might think of it as being like, oh, traditional publishing has existed for a really long time, but it's actually not true. Yeats basically self-published. His sisters published his book and his books, I should say. Shakespeare certainly did not traditionally publish. He had basically um, uh, folks who paid for him to do it, right? Patrons who basically put the books out for him, right? Put the plays out, I should say, right? Traditional publishing in its form, Dickinson, sold little, snippets of his book. So, it isn't to say that this is like an ancient practice. This really goes back to the, 20s, 30s from there on, right? So with traditional publishing, let's talk a little bit about how it happens. The first thing is that if you have like a book of fiction or nonfiction, you have a somewhat wider array of options. You are able to send books to agents. You are able to send books to contests, and there, in most instances, there is a cost in terms of time. My first book, I won $2,000 when I won the contest. The secret is that I probably had spent well more than $2,000 sending it to contests before that. So that was just like me recouping what I'd put in, right? Um, so with traditional publishing, you have that option. You usually will need to produce a cover letter. Sometimes they'll want more. I would, by the way, resist any, I would be hesitant to send to places that say you have to have 4 or 5 documents. First of all, that's rude. It's a lot. When we as writers want to produce much more interesting things than that, I recognize the value of some of those things, but I think generally a query letter and maybe a synopsis or something like that is reasonable. If you're hitting some place that's asking for a huge number of documents, I mean, I would imagine they're seriously considering, but unless you're very interested in publishing with them, I would probably not go down that. Okay. Um, in terms of what happens when okay, so you send things off. One of the things you should expect is that if you want to traditionally publish a book, if you're going to start submitting today, a best case scenario is that you're going to publish about 2 years out. Okay. Because generally, once you get in someone's pipeline, that's about what it takes. Now, there in a traditional contract, there will not be an upfront cost. Okay, that doesn't mean there's no cost, but it does mean it means there's no upfront cost. Okay, and what basically happens is you say, I'm going to give up my autonomy as a writer, not completely. Usually have some agency within the contract itself. That's something you want to look for. See what you get to keep, right? See what it is you get final say about, right? You also will be giving up some of your rights, whether it's First American serial rights, that almost certainly goes to the press, which means you can't reprint somewhere else. If you get poems published or something later, then you won't be able to resubmit them or anything. Um, Once they're in print through the book, they're generally not, you won't be able to do anything else with them. That's true of short stories as well. Um, you also will give up things like foreign language rights. You'll give up film rights, again, to varying degrees. Usually there's some amount that you get to keep. In terms of royalties, what you should expect is that you will be getting 10, 15%. It depends. That's usually what I've seen in contracts. One thing to say about that is that when a publisher says royalties, it doesn't mean like, okay, your book sells on Amazon for $20, you're getting $2 back. That's not how that works. Basically, when your book sells on Amazon, Amazon is purchasing that book at a trade paperback discount. That means that they're buying it at 55% off. That's roughly $9. Of that $9, a certain amount is going to go in printing and production. That's usually about $4 of the $5 that comes back. That would mean that a writer would get about 50 cents a book. Okay. And that would be in perpetuity. So that's something that you want to bear in mind. Now, again, you don't have an upfront cost, but each time you sell a book, right, you are going to be ultimately paying the press. And you get, some choice about covers and things like that. You get some choice about interior design, all that kind of good stuff. It's to varying degrees. The press is hypothetically incentivized to really push your book, although as I mentioned, with some bigger publishers, it's perfectly possible that you have that you're one of that. It would be wonderful if you're part of that 4% where they're gonna really sell your book. It's also possible you're part of that 96% where it's like they're going to put in a good faith marketing effort. But again, it's not going to be a book that's in every Barnes and Noble in America or something like that, right? That's a good thing to know, by the way, too. People often seem very worried about being in physical bookstores, and I see the value of that. Don't get me wrong, but the vast majority of books that people buy are online by like a lot, right? For better or worse. And look, I'm doing my release at a bookstore. I love bookstores. They're amazing. My local bookstore is like a very important place for me. It's also the case that when I buy my books, I love to go over there and pick things up, but if I need to buy something, a lot of times it's quicker and easier with Amazon. 30%, less than 30% of book sales are ever done in person. And I think 30% is probably a high side. But okay, traditional publishing, again, when we look at the contract, we want to see what the terms are on all of those things that you're turning over, because they're not just publishing the book out of the pure unbridled goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because you're giving certain things up in order for that exchange to work. Okay. Self-publishing, which is way at the other end of the scale, and then we'll swing back and talk about hybrid a little bit. Self-publishing is where you are gonna go rogue, do it yourself, right? And there's certainly some virtues to that. Self-publishing, a few, maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, was a real dirty word, right? People are like, ooh, so you self-published? Ooh, that's no good, right? But things look different, especially because a lot of authors have chosen to self-publish. Now, when we self-publish, a lot of people imagine, and I think that unfortunately this does end up being true for some people, that you just go and you throw it on Amazon. First of all, that's definitely not what you want to do, because you all put such amazing time and energy into your books, and you should do right by them. And doing right by them means getting a team of experts who's going to help you make the best possible informed choices about the text. Um, so the so in terms of what you need, you're looking for someone who's going to be a developmental editor. And this is someone who is experienced, who knows your book nose to tail, and is going to have a good conversation with you about it. Now, why is this important? Because when the reviews of your book come out, you don't want to be you don't want to be blindsided by them saying, well, I really think this and this and this and this. You want to have had those conversations in advance. And one of the things I will tell you is a lot of times folks would come to presses I worked at and say, well, this is the book and I don't want to change anything about it. That is a sure recipe to not have your book come into the. And the reason is because we as authors are often not the most amazing judges of our own work, right? We are great at having an original vision and taking that vision and saying, okay, I'm going to make this change and this change and this change. But even when we've had a lot of beta readers, you want someone who is reading the book in the context of publication. With my book, I had that attitude where I was like, you know what, I think this book is pretty much ready to go, and there's not really much I want to change because I'd been through a whole bunch of iterations of it. My developmental editor Atmosphere gave me a bunch of recommendations. I took 40% of them, and I'm glad I did, because the things I changed were things that reviewers commented on. And they said, oh, I'm really glad for this and this and this. And they were things that I think really enriched the book. If I hadn't had those conversations, the book would have been considerably worse for it. So you're looking for a developmental editor, someone who really knows their stuff and who has a track record of putting books, great book, acting as editor for great books that are in the world. Secondly, you are looking for a cover designer, not someone who's going to create a single instance of an image. And this needs to be someone who is familiar with Ingram templates. They also need to be able to work in InDesign, because InDesign is really the language of existing contemporary cover design. Okay. You need somebody who has done it before, not like this is my first run at it, because understanding the conventions of contemporary publication is not something that you just pick up in a book. and know them, because again, you have to be very familiar with the texts that are out there. Thirdly, you need an interior designer. This is actually the trickiest person to find, because interior designers for books often get grabbed up very quickly by presses. There aren't that many people who do this, and the people who do, it's often again, they're often in the midst of other projects for other places, because by golly, we're always looking for them. Okay, so you need someone who with a knowledge of interior design in order to make the inside of your book look good. You need a proofer. The last thing you want is to put the book up on Amazon and then be like, oh man, page 7, bottom of the page, that the is missing that E, right? That's no good. And it gives a reader a sort of sour taste about your book from the very get-go. And you need somebody who's a pro, because there's lots of stuff that you would never think about. Compound words. My gosh, I had never realized the sheer range of words that in English we can't seem to decide if they're two words or they're one combined word, or maybe they're hyphenated or whatever, right? There is not really a logic to it, and so you have to have somebody who's versed in those kinds of things, right? And then you need a marketing team. The marketing team is also probably the second hardest thing to find. Um, there are companies who do this, though. Atmosphere is one of them, where if somebody self-publishes a book, one of the things you can do is hire us to come in and do your marketing. And it's actually a really good investment. When you hire a marketing team, you should reasonably expect to be paying about $2,000. And the reason is because it's a number of months worth of work where you're working with experts and they're needing to pay for things. They need to get, it costs something to get a guaranteed Kirkus review. It costs something to get advertising for books. It costs something to do design, and to come up with marketing bundles and all this different kind of stuff. Okay. And there's things that work and things that don't. I can tell you up front that marketing teams that are very focused on things like individual conferences or individual stores are often missing out on big opportunities. If you have somewhere reach out to you and they say, oh, we're going to stock your book at this conference in London, what they mean is, we have this table in London, we're going to put some of your books out there and see if anybody wants to buy them, and we're not really going to do anything to push them, right? I've seen this time and time again where writers buy in for something like this. It's not a good faith effort, guys, right? Like, that's not something that you can count on. What you can count on is, I mentioned a couple of really good resources: presses that have a Goodreads page, presses that have a NetGalley page, presses that have a representation at a conference, but they have a relatively small number of books that they are carrying, and they have some vested interest in selling them, right? Also, they shouldn't be selling you spots. That's not how that works, right? Additionally, yes, anything that does smart online advertising, right? Targeted review solicitation, again, sending out ARCs, advanced review copies. Primarily, you really want those to be electronic, because otherwise they have a cost, right, that is greater than probably what you want to pay. But again, that's another thing that can have a cost to it as well, as sending out those ARCs or producing those ARCs. Now, you might say to yourself, Kyle, assembling all of those things together, very challenging. True. And some people have those resources or are willing to cultivate those resources. That's awesome, right? You should definitely pursue that. Hybrid publishing is a mix between and traditional and self-publishing. Okay. First of all, there's a couple of things you should look for. If you're going to work with a hybrid publisher, you want them to be selective, meaning you want them to have picked your manuscript, right? Now, bear in mind that kind of selectivity is not going to be quite the same as it is with a traditional publisher. A traditional publisher will sometimes sit for 6 months on a manuscript before they look at it. A hybrid publisher should get back to you much more quickly. If you're waiting more than 2 months to hear about your book, that's too long. They should be more responsible to get back to you in a more timely manner. Can't say that with traditional publishing, but with hybrids you can. Okay. If they offer you a contract, right, again, what you want to look at are the terms that are involved. First of all, um, you should not be giving up, you should be giving up relatively limited rights. Those should be things that stick with you, right? At Atmosphere, we do not keep any of the rights for the book. That means that a writer can republish, they can reprint, they keep the screenwriting optioning, all that kind of good stuff. Okay. Um, you want to look at the amount of the amount of marketing that's actually provided with the book. You also want to look at their masthead. So their masthead is going to tell you the quality of people that you're working with, right? And one of the worst things that happens is people start working with a company, and then in 2 weeks they're outsourced to someone in the Philippines who doesn't know their book, right? That's not great. It's not where you want to be. You want to be dealing with someone on the ground in your country of origination who knows the language, knows the genre, knows the book, you know, nose to tail, and who also is familiar with everything that you're trying to do with the text itself. Okay. Um, you also want to look at pricing, obviously. Um, one of the things I would say is this: uh, carefully consider if there are options, what the range of marketing is. Marketing is the number one thing that people want more of because there is a direct corollary between the success of your book and the amount of marketing that it receives, right? That's not to say like, oh, if you have some terrible book that you can just market it beautifully and it all works. That doesn't work that way. But great marketing starts when you, with your developmental editor, helping make the book more as professional as it can possibly be, and also again helping to consider all the possible options for the text itself. Um, in terms of each stage along the way, you want someone who's a seasoned professional and knows what you're doing. Um, one last point to sort of add to this, right, in terms of what your goals might be as a writer. Um, the other thing that I guess I would watch for with a contract is this, okay? Um, with Atmosphere, one of the things we do is we package everything together. We say, okay, this is what this is like. You marketing is going to be included with this, and developmental editing, and done and done, and it's all going to be packaged together. I talk to a lot of people on a day-to-day basis who work with a press that says, "Oh, and by the way, you'll want to do this, and it's going to cost money. And by the way, you'll want to do this, and by the way, you'll want to do this." And it's a never-ending string of things that oh, they mysteriously never thought of that, right? Oh, we probably should have told you that earlier, but we forgot about that, right? Um, it's not an honest way to deal with people. Obviously, that's not good. But then additionally, a press should have a very clear vision of how to publish your book. Atmosphere publishes 30 books a month, right? We know what it takes for the book to win awards. We know what it takes for the book to do this and that and the other. And you want to make sure those are things that are necessarily baked into what you're doing. So again, um, there's lots of folks, I want to emphasize this, um, who are there's no shortage of folks who are good actors in the market, who are, who have their mode of how they want to produce a book. That's great. That's how the written word finds its way into the world. And you, as writers, you want to be connected with those people who are legitimate and forthright and are producing great work that you want to be a part of. Yes, that's good. Um, and in order to do that, we want to be as informed as possible about the range of what's out there, what kinds of questions we should be asking um, about the actual contracts and things like that. I will also tell you this. Part of the reason I'm here today, and I love sharing with folks, is so that we can have this conversation. Also, I would invite you, if you have a manuscript that you want to submit, send it over to Atmosphere. Let's have a good conversation about where the text is and all that kind of good stuff, right? If you feel like it's ready to go, our reading team is going to be expedient and honest, and those are things that we really strive for. So, at any rate, I have talked all's ears off. That's how I roll. What questions can I answer for you? Feel free to unmute or throw them in the chat, whatever sounds good to you.
Go for it, Herb.
Where is your company?
On marketing, do you do a lot of ads on like Facebook and Twitter and maybe search words on Amazon? Is that how you do it?
That's a fair bit of it, yeah. And it's a really good question. So you meant the last thing you mentioned, I think, is critically important, which is on Amazon, you want your book to be in certain categories because then it's eligible to compete in those categories, right? And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, we have like Atmosphere for many weeks on end had the number one book in squirrel fiction. I kid you not. And squirrel fiction is, as you might guess, not a particularly popular niche. And so it was a children's book called Allie the Albino Squirrel. And Allie, man, that's not the name of the writer, but Allie had a really good run, partially because of those search words. Yes, social media advertising does help. Now you can't dump unlimited money into that because first of all, it has diminishing returns after a certain point. So you have to couple it with other things, right? And that's part of where a press wants to say, okay, you know what? We have this set of review sites that we work with. We really want to be investing in them. We, are going to produce a really top-notch um, uh, front cover letter for our books. We're going to, get you connected with these folks. We have this system called Author Connect, where we match writers together in order to like improve their marketing, meaning that if you're like, oh, I want to go read in Toledo, Ohio, okay, well, let's get you connected with someone. But yes, there's a range of things we do. Those are definitely on the roster as good marketing practices.
Annie in the chat says, what genres do you publish or publish most often?
I bet it would not surprise you to learn that fiction is the most common, as in a general sense, is the most common type that we publish. Well, we publish a range of things: nonfiction, fiction, children's literature, poetry, short stories, and anything in between. Okay, and we have some fairly unique publishing situations that we encounter. Right, we certainly have books by very established writers who are going down a path that they've been down before, meaning that they publish multiple books, and here's the next one in line. We have people who are publishing trilogies. We have people who are publishing duologies. There's a whole range of things. We publish hybrid text too. We have a book right now that's like I talked to somebody the other day where basically they had a mixed medium book where they had images online that were going to be connected, but they didn't want to put them in the book themselves. So then we're linking all of these things together. It's a cool project. It's ekphrastic poetry plus some other stuff. So if you have thought of it in terms of genre, we are interested in looking at it. We do speculative fiction, we do romance. There's limits on what we do in terms of maybe more risque things, but that's a very fuzzy line, right? And so part of the challenge is that I'll tell you this: one of our most popular books was this book called Permission by Mark Crystal, and it's about a guy who is addicted to cocaine and prostitutes who's living in LA. Doesn't sound like a very good premise, but it's actually a really interesting book. It reads a little bit like Lolita or something like that. And I was the editor for that book, which is not at all my type of text, but it's fun. It was fun to have a conversation about. So Paul says 50 cents a book on a 2,000 book run doesn't sound like a positive thing to get into, right? Paul, I agree with you. It amounts to, how much do we make off that? 50 cents a book off 2,000. So you're basically making $1,000, right? Um, that is not what I signed up for. Now, look, I didn't, and this is an interesting thing to consider. Unless you are insane, right? You didn't start writing your book because you're like, oh, whole bunch of money, right? Like, that's not how we as writers work, right? But on the other hand, um, as writers, we deserve to be the beneficiary. Um, we deserve to be the beneficiary of our own success. Now, what does that mean? Well, my book that came out with Atmosphere, I'm going to be honest, I never worried that much about how many books I sold in terms of quantity because what I was much more interested in was the doors it was going to open for me, right? And that's a big thing to think about with your book, not just not just that the book gets out there and gets into people's hands, but also that most of the way that writers see a return on the books themselves is through the opportunities it creates, the opportunities to go speak at this place or that place. Oh, they're going to pay me X amount of money to go do this. One of my friends just won a residency, right? That's an amazing opportunity, grants, those kinds of things. Those doors start to open a little bit once you've got a book in hand that you can present somebody with, right? And so I think it's great to think about numbers of copies sold. It's also good to think about, again, what doors it opens as well. But yeah, I mean, $1,000 on selling 2,000, it's probably like 2,000 books. It's not insignificant, but guys, like, a lot of my books that did very well, and bear in mind, I'm a poet. So our cap is much lower. So like if you sell 500 copies of a book of poetry, man, that's like a poetry bestseller. You did amazing, right? And my third book is about um, basically I mentioned that big tour that I went on. After I went on that big tour, around the U.S., I had won a residency in Australia, and so I flew down there. When I got there, I figured out it was basically um, just somebody's house, right? Which that I didn't have a big problem with, but they also lived out in the middle of nowhere and they didn't want us to leave. It was a real kind of misery situation. And so, I and another writer who were there, she was a dancer at the time. We like found a way to, we walked to town, which was not close. It was like 5 miles, and called found a way to get out of there. And then, at 5 in the morning, we pushed our bags out the window and like went and lived in Sydney in these like horrible hostels that were like decrepit. And I wrote a book of poetry about that, about being really sad in Australia called Sympathy from the Devil. And that book did very well, right? And I think it probably sold copies or something like that, but it won a lot of acclaim, which was nice. And again, I never worried about it making a bunch of money. I um, kind of knew what I was getting into. Jerry says, uh, I have a hybrid publisher. Seems a bit lukewarm in terms of marketing my books, and I have to go outside to market. Yeah, that can be a conceivable downside. And again, first of all, Jerry, I'm sorry that's happening, right? And if you want, you should absolutely, I can send you some information and Atmosphere about the marketing team that you would work with. It's very transparent in terms of, what we offer. It is a bummer with marketing, which is that you want to know what's in that contract, right? And not just like, oh, we're going, and I will say this too. One of the most challenging kinds of questions that I get is when people try to really nail me down to like, what exactly does Atmosphere do in every capacity? And one of the challenges is, I first of all think that's a really good impulse. You should want to know what concrete tasks your marketing team is going to do. Now, it is helpful to go and see what other marketing um, you know, what other marketing does this press actually do, right? Um, and so if you take a look at that and you're like, oh, they actually did some things, their books are winning awards, all of these other things, then you see like the wheels spinning. If on the other hand, um, you don't really see any indication of that, that's often a bad sign too. And that's a way to kind of look under the hood on these things, right? To find out what they're actually gonna offer you. Linda says, how does distribution fit in? It's a great question. Um, so uh, when you work with a press, the magical word is Ingram. Okay. So Ingram Spark is sort of it's not necessarily that it's the gold standard. It's more that it's kind of like the only standard. So like there aren't one of the things that in the old version of publication, 20, 25 years ago, maybe even 15, a lot of times the traditional press would say, we're going to do a print run of X number of books. And they would warehouse them somewhere in Jersey or something like that. Or maybe they'd have, a stash out in LA or whatever. And then if someone ordered your book in Perth, Australia, you were probably eating like a little loss on that or something like that, right? Um, yeah, so one of the things that has changed is Ingram kind of leveled the playing field. The way Ingram works is they are a distributor who has printers all over the world. They got a printer in Stockholm. They got a printer in a bunch of printers in England. They've got printers in Australia. They've got and they work with all of them, right? And so you get a relatively uniform print wherever your book is sold. Now, that model is called print on demand. Print on demand is where when a copy of your book is requested, Amazon will say, "Oh, we've already got 10 copies on hand." Now, bear in mind, one of the misconceptions people often have about this is that they um, um, is that, oh, that means people are only going to get my book when um, they request a copy of it. Not exactly, right? It's not like you're going to be like, oh, there's no print run whatsoever. No, I mean, Amazon's going to buy X number based on what it thinks that you're going to sell, right? Because it doesn't want to order one book at a time. That's going to mean they're basically eating a loss on that. Barnes and Noble Online is going to buy copies. The Powell's Waterstone's Book Depository, and by the way, physical bookstores, they decide what they're going to carry based on online sales. So if you want your book in physical bookstores, it has to sell well online. Okay, that's generally how that works. Um, so in terms of distribution, you want your book distributed by Ingram, right? In terms of printer, you may not want it printed by like. Bear in mind, I'm not singing the praises as like their customer service is abysmal, but you don't have to deal with that. That's the good news. We take care of that, right? And it's one of the downsides of like self-publishing is that I say this from experience. If you want like help from Ingram in terms of actually getting the book produced, you're talking to somebody in Tennessee who may or may not exactly know how to help you, right? I've been there, right? Not to Tennessee, but on the phone. So you want distribution. I really recommend POD. I think again, one of the downsides of traditional publishing, where you have like a stockpile of books. Also, you get returns that way, which you can actually eat a small loss on that from book sales and things like that. It's one of the questions that's going a little deeper into this than maybe we need to, but the question of whether your book is returnable or not has some effect on whether bookstores will carry it. Um, Paul has a good recommendation here, which is it's good to be famous. Yes. If you have anything that makes you famous before you start writing, it's a terrific idea. If you won the Super Bowl, that's really good. It helps, right? Or alternatively, if you're Mary Oliver, or perhaps, you're Prince Harry. If you have the ability to become Prince Harry, I highly recommend it. It seems pretty good, right? And then, what does an interior designer do? Well, one of the things I can tell you, Paul, is I am not an interior designer, nor would I pretend to be. They take the interior of the book on our little 8.5, 8.5 by 5, 8.5 by 11 pages. And they say, okay, we're going to transition this into a much more attractive book size, which is not 8.5 by 11. We're going to look at the font size and think about what it should be in correlation with that. We are going to go look at the spine length. We are going to look at interior features of the book. You know, when you've hit a book that's got interior design that you like, because it's like, oh man, look how elegantly they've done these like little illustrations on the inside, or like the numeration looks nice, right? Like, here's the key thing: when you know a book does not have a good interior designer, you're vividly aware of it. When it has a good one, you may never notice at all, right? That's the magic of interior design. Um, how do I see AI changing publishing, traditional, self-published, hybrid? Um, well, there are things, let's put it this way. It definitely, um, it definitely is the case that AI allow us to do more than we did before. Meaning that, with our current system, if we didn't have certain forms of not exactly AI, but like tech, um, it would take so much longer to do what we do. Um, we at no point in our process, like your DE is a person, right? Like naturally, your cover designer is a person, your interior designer is a person. Um, but they have certain things that like assist, right? Um, because and so like I was telling Linda when we were when we were chatting over email, I have some weird disability where uh, I cannot understand time zones. I do not know what this is, and I don't know what the name for this disease is, but like it doesn't click in my brain somehow. And the reason I never have to worry about this, even though I talk to people in Australia, I talk to writers in the UK, I talk to writers in Switzerland, is because I have an automated scheduling system that does all these things for me. If I did not have that, I would have to spend a lot more energy on those things. But look, AI, I don't think AI are going to get to the point that they're going to be writing best-selling novels for us. I think there's too many choices that a person has to make. You could design a program to write a book, but in the course of that, you would basically be like writing the book anyway, because you'd be programming the machine to do it. That's one man's opinion, right? Um, I will answer this last one, and I think I don't want to take up any too much more of anybody's time. Children's books. What about an illustrator if the author isn't the illustrator? It's a very good question. Um, Children's books are a whole thing. So first, I'll tell you this: people imagine that like a children's book might be easier to write and produce um, than like a book of fiction. That is incorrect, right? First of all, you do have to find an illustrator. An illustrator for a book usually runs you about $4,000, and that's for a standard 28-page children's book. Okay, that's on top of any other cost that you have. So the production of a children's book, if you did it through a hybrid publisher, is around $10,000. It's probably what you're looking at realistically, right? Now, a thing to tell you about that is the good news is the rate of return on children's books is really quite good. Um, People buy a lot of kids' books. I didn't realize this until we started doing it, right? And I should have known that because I buy a lot of kids' books for my children. But like, people buy a lot of children's books. Like our best-selling book of all time is a children's book. Bello the Cello sold like 50,000 plus copies. It was unstoppable, right? Um, and so children's books often see a relatively high rate of return. So it's not, if you work with a hybrid press, it's actually, it's not like easy to see a return on it, but you get that, revenue in perpetuity, and they tend to stick around, right? Which is nice, right? Um, my wife was reading Eric Carle to our son this evening. I was thinking to myself, like, man, the family and estate of Eric Carle, because I think Eric Carle has passed away, must be doing very well, right? Like we bought a lot of Eric Carle books, right? So that's something to consider. Um, but I will turn this back over to Linda. Thanks, guys, for having me. So wonderful to be here and to answer your questions. And Jerry, I will put in the thread, I'm going to put a link to our services page as well, because this is not something that we necessarily like throw on the front page of our press. But there's like a bunch of stuff in here that you can pick from. And what you want is book boost, publicity, and promotions. And I'm going to just put this up there for you. Very good. My pleasure. All right. And by the way, folks, just one added thing. If you are interested in having your book considered for Atmosphere, one of the things you can do is I'm going to put my email in here. It's late, so let me make sure I didn't misspell anything. Okay. You are welcome to actually just get a hold of me directly, and I will get your book into the expedited run of things. You know, one of the things we love to do is if folks come and hear me speak and they're excited about Atmosphere, you don't have to wait in line. We're going to make sure that you get to the front of the queue, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kyle. This is wonderful. I appreciate it. I don't want to keep you up. You know, he's 2 hours later than us, so it's like 10 o'clock where he is, folks. But so I want to thank you, and I also want to urge people to visit atmospherepress.com, because I believe I saw a whole bunch of books on there, and you can look at the books and see what they produce, and they're great. And if you happen to be a member of Authors Guild, they've got tons of authors that are members there along with you. So that's part of what I was impressed with. So authors seem to have great confidence in you, and that's one of the things we look at, Kyle. And so, folks, if any follow-up questions you have, like Kyle said, he'd be happy to help you. Or you can get in touch with me, and you know how to do that. And I'm gonna put this recording up on YouTube if you need a little refresher to be able to run through it again. So thanks, Kyle. I'm gonna do a little applause thing. People can.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you for being here. I think that I'm gonna get called away by very small children, but it has been so wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you for your amazing questions, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Okay.
Appreciate it, Kyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Bye.
Thank you.
I am going to